Good afternoon, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, and everyone joining us online as well. On behalf of the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore, I welcome you to this afternoon's webinar entitled The 2024 Elections in Sri Lanka, Political and Economic Prospects, jointly organized by ISES and the Overseas Development Institute, or ODI. As most of us are familiar with, Sri Lanka will be voting for a president on 21st September. These elections are taking place within an economic, political, and geopolitical context which is in flux. The country is negotiating its way out of a crippling economic crisis. The economic collapse of 2022 forced Sri Lankans to grapple with severe shortages of essentials like food, medicine, and fuel. This in turn led to mass protests that resulted in the fall of the then President Gotabaya Rajapaksa. Under President Wickremesinghe, the government secured a $3 billion IMF bailout package. The economy is now showing signs of stabilizing, with year-on-year inflation dropping dramatically from nearly 70% in 2022. The economy is also starting to grow, and gross official foreign reserves have increased to somewhere about US 5.6 billion by June 2024. Having said that, Sri Lankans are still confronted with high prices, I should say, that are linked to severe decline in purchasing power and high rates of unemployment. Data from the World Bank reveals a stark increase in poverty rates, doubling from 13.1% in 2021 to 25% in 2022. The country's reliance on IMF loans has also led to the implementation of austerity measures, and these austerity measures are highly unpopular and may influence political decisions in the coming election. The leading candidates in the electoral fray have outlined differing economic visions, with at least one of the leading candidates committing himself to making massive changes to the IMF loan agreement. The political and constitutional future of Sri Lanka is also being debated in these elections. In particular, the issue of the devolution of power to provinces is being mooted. This has long been a standing demand by, among others, the Tamil minority. However, this will require a constitutional amendment and has been opposed by sections within the Buddhist majority, including sections of the Buddhist religious leadership. The election may also have wider geopolitical and geo-economic implications. Sri Lanka is in the center of India-China competition for influence in South Asia and the Indian Ocean. The country has often attempted to manage a complex dynamics between India and China. This was reflected, for instance, in the controversy over the arrival of a Chinese scientific research ship at Sri Lanka's Hambantota port. Following India's objections, the Sri Lankan government modified the length of the stay of the Chinese ship. Needless to say, Sri Lanka is sensitive to tensions in the Indian Ocean and the evolving strategic scenario in the Indo-Pacific. Here, I would emphasize that we should note that Sri Lanka is not only seeking to balance India and China geopolitically, but also looking for economic and financial relations with both. Thus, as Sri Lanka heads into the elections, it is timely to survey the political landscape, examine the key issues that will shape the political trajectory, analyze the impact of economic choices, and assess the implications of international developments on the elections, and perhaps even conversely, analyze the impact of the elections on regional geopolitics. And I'm delighted that today we have the perfect set of experts with us to help us navigate through this set of very serious and complex issues. I will not be able to go through their extensive CVs and credentials, but I'd like to very quickly introduce the speakers to the audience. And I'll go by the batting order in the program itself. So first, let me introduce Dr. Ganeshan Vignaraja, who is a non-resident senior fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. Concurrently, he has an affiliation as a visiting senior fellow at ODI in London, and he's the advisor to the President of Sri Lanka on strategic trade policy. He's also the professorial fellow in economics and trade at Gateway House in Mumbai. Following on, we have Professor Dirk Willem T. Welder, who is a Principal Research Fellow and Director of ODI's International Economic Development Group. His extensive research on topics like investment, trade, macroeconomics, and economic transformation has been published widely and featured in prominent media outlets around the globe. Next in the list of experts on our panel today is Professor Neera Wickremesinghe. Professor Neera Wickremesinghe is a professor of modern South Asian studies at Leiden University in the Netherlands. Her research centers on issues of belonging and everyday life under colonialism in Sri Lanka and the Indian Ocean. She is the author of several books, including Slave in a Palanquin, Colonial Servitude and Resistance in Sri Lanka, which was awarded the John F. Richards 2021 Prize in South Asian History by the American Historical Association. And then next, following on from Professor Vikram Singh, is Professor C. Raja Mohan, who also is a visiting research professor at the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. He was the director of the Institute of South Asian Studies from May 2018 to December 2021. He was also a professor of South Asian Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. And last but not least is our in-house expert on Sri Lanka, Dr. Rajni Gamage. Dr. Rajni Gamage is a research fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. Her research interests are in the politics of governance and state transformation and development and inequality in Sri Lanka. She holds a PhD in political science and international relations from the University of Queensland. Now, with that, I wish everyone an enriching session. And without further ado, I would like to begin this session by inviting my friend Ganeshan Vignarajan to please take the floor. Ganesh, all yours.
Thank you very much, Iqbal. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Great. It's a real pleasure to be at this first ISAS ODI joint webinar on Sri Lanka's presidential elections. And I want to try to make 4 points to sort of set the scene. The first is that, as Iqbal rightly said, there's been quite a remarkable economic recovery in Sri Lanka since the dark days of 2022 and debt default and crisis. The queues have disappeared for food and fuel. The central bank is projecting growth of 4% in this year. Remember, in the crisis year of 2022, the economy contracted by 7.8%. Usable reserves are up. And this is really due to decisive stabilization policies by Wickremesinghe administration, an IMF program, and Indian aid, which is often forgotten. Now, James Carville, Bill Clinton's political advisor, famously said that when it comes to elections, it's the economy stupid. So President Wickremesinghe, an experienced center-right politician representing the political status quo, ought to be a shoo-in to win the election. But it's possible that this year's election may be an exception. Sometimes you get a leader who implements austerity who can pay a political price. So that's the first point I want to make. The second is really that we have this unpredictable three-horse race and uncertainty. And there are probably two issues that explain this three-horse race. Firstly, there's been lots of human suffering, as again Iqbal mentioned. A quarter of all Sri Lankans have fallen into poverty due to the economic contraction and the cost of living crisis. And there is a perception of rent-seeking or corruption by some politicians. We have one rival candidate, Sajid Premadasa, who is the leader of the opposition and head of what's called the SJB. He's a broadly status quo candidate offering a center-right platform with a social market economy. And he's the son of a former president. And then you have quite a remarkable political personality, Anurakumar Dissanayake, or AKD, who's leader of the JVP, the main left-wing party. Now, he offers something a little bit different to the Marxist-Leninist thing that we may have thought. He's talking about a pro-business, small business, if you like, platform with the diaspora. He's talking about cutting red tape. He's talking about political systems change, anti-corruption, social welfare, and a big role for the state. The problem is that we don't really have high quality polls, so we don't really know who could be the winner. And both the rivals of Wickremesinghe say they will dissolve parliament and hold elections. So it's only in 2025 that we will get a new regime with some clarity. Now, whoever wins this thing, and that's my third point, is going to have lots of economic challenges. One is the debt problem. The official creditors have agreed a restructuring deal on debt. But the private creditors' deal has been elusive. And it could be the case that in 2028, if we get these two deals, Sri Lanka will have to service all its external debt and have the foreign exchange to meet its import requirements. So not very long away, right? The second thing is, although growth may be 4%, we really need 5 to 6% based on export-led and tourism-led growth if we are going to deal with this poverty problem and also make our debt repayments. And in all of this, Sri Lanka really needs to consider continuing some elements of the current stabilization program, but add structural policies. And Dirk Willem and I have edited a book of essays that tries to provide 27 proposals, under this theme of from debt default to transformative growth, on how Sri Lanka can make this transition. We talk about a consensus across the parties on the economic direction of Sri Lanka, and particularly we're talking about an open economy with a sort of market-led trajectory, if this is going to come. There has to be debt sustainability through proactive debt management and strengthened legal frameworks, including a debt management office. The central bank's independence is fundamental to all of this, to enable effective monetary policy and financial stability. We have to have sustainable fiscal policy through transparent budgeting, spending controls, and better tax administration. We have to have pragmatic efforts to transform the economy and to support the private sector by streamlining business regulations and promoting trade through supply chains and trade deals. And we have to make this growth very inclusive, right, by targeting the poor properly, and we have to ensure food security. So there are at least these things that have to be done by any government, regardless of the rhetoric. The last key point I want to say is that international support is going to be critical for Sri Lanka to come out of this crisis. There is an IMF program of 3 billion that's ongoing for macroeconomic stability and debt sustainability. This has brought another 5 billion worth of additional ADB World Bank money. So there's $8 billion that has come to help Sri Lanka through this program. Now, both the SJB and the JVP say they want to renegotiate this IMF program. And this, may be very popular on the campaign trail because people have suffered austerity, but it could lead to a drying up of the foreign assistance to Sri Lanka. And I'm happy to elaborate on that in the chat, Iqbal, if that's useful. But really what we need to do is to continue with this IMF program, reallocate fiscal spending towards growth, and better target the welfare measures towards the real poor. So my final word is really that we're going to think of Sri Lanka's economic and political prospects with a new president and a new parliament for sure by 2025. And we will probably have an improved economy, but fragile, clouded by political and economic uncertainty. My plea is that the new administration should build on the macroeconomic platform that we have, an independent central bank, which is obviously the core element, but also fiscal responsibility and open trade policies, while tackling poverty and corruption. And whoever comes to power, Sri Lanka's development partners, including Singapore, which has been very important, should stand ready to help the country to deal with the crisis, because the consequences of failure are going to be very high in economic and human terms. Thank you, Iqbal.
Thank you, Ganesh. So I'll move on now to our next speaker, Professor Dirk Willem Steenwelder. Could I invite you to take the floor, please?
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Professor Iqbal, and let me also express gratitude to the wonderful collaboration between ODI and ISS and US. It's fantastic to be to having this seminar, and it's really important to think about the upcoming presidential elections. And it's been really good to hear the very detailed account from Dr. Ganesh Visnaraya on what's at stake. And I just want to zoom out a little bit and sort of highlight some of the issues that are at stake here. I think we've heard that Sri Lanka has been able to sort of stabilize the economy somewhat, and thanks to the good policies, and that's been really, really excellent news. But of course, we need to now see more. We need to sort of now make sure that whoever is going to be the president will be able to put in place a path towards a more inclusive, greener, and transformative economic growth than has been seen before, in order for Sri Lanka to avoid future macroeconomic crises. And I think there have been so many crises, and there have been so many times that Sri Lanka has had to seek external support from, for example, the IMF, which has been a sign that something hasn't been going well for quite some time, and that now needs to change. And we need to see signs here that Sri Lanka can move and can engage in these transitions that Ganesh was also talking about. So let me just sort of reiterate them. Sri Lanka needs to go from default and stable debt to declining debt to GDP ratios. It needs to go, very importantly, go from a weakly diversified economy towards a transformed, high productive, export-oriented economy. It needs to be going from a, what some would say, a closed, still a closed economy to, and a still protective economy towards a more open economy. It needs to move from growth that has been driven in the past by fiscal deficits to one that is being led by net export surpluses. It needs to move from an economy which has suffered in the sort of in the last five years, economy which has been affected by monetary policy based on political interference, to an economy where there's an independent central bank which is focused on price stability, which avoids crisis and creates jobs. It needs to move from an economy from that has low taxes at the moment, with few or too few fiscal rules, to an economy that is governed by principles on the effectiveness of fiscal spending, issues like cost-benefit analysis. And of course, there need to be more transition need to happen. But this is not like a quick win, right? This is really important that that this is a long-term project, and the heart of that is economic transformation. It lies economic transformation, and it's really important that an economy like Sri Lanka is able to transform its economy to a high productive economy, because that leads to higher living standards. It helps the economy to become more resilient to economic shocks like the ones we've seen in the last few years. It's going to be more inclusive. You create more jobs if you have a more transformed economy. It's also going to be likely to be more greener, because you innovate more, you can have more green technology. And it's not a cul-de-sac, as it were. It's not a dead end if you not transform your economy, because then you're not going to become more competitive in the longer run. And if you have a more transformed economy, you don't need to go to the IMF again, and you won't have these sharp increases in poverty. So how to do this? Well, Sri Lanka is not on its own that needs to go through some of these transitions. And there are some other countries, of course, that are also going through these transitions. But the importance of economic transformation means a number of things. And we've done quite a lot of work over the last decade to supporting countries in South Asia, but also in Africa, to think around what it takes to transform your economy. Now, of course, there are a range of policies, but there are lots of institutional issues that are really important here. And the first one is, I think, where Ganesh also mentioned is, and what we highlighted in the book that we've just edited together, is this consensus that needs to happen around the future direction of the economy. And I think that's what the president should do first, is the new president should think about that to engineer and move towards a consensus that it's really important to go for a transformed economy. Without a more productive economy, you will likely have to go back to the IMF time and time again. You need to transform your economy, and this is there needs to be cross-party consensus on this, and I think that's really important. Secondly, what we've seen in successful cases of transformation is that there is an importance of one public agency that is able to coordinate all the various actors and direct the economy in such a way so that you don't get different policies and an uncoordinated lot of stakeholders. So it's really important that there is a top-down approach towards this, moving towards this new direction, this new transformative economy, which brings together a range of stakeholders around fiscal policy, monetary policy, but also private sector development and trade policies and industrial policies as well, which need to be more open. Thirdly, it's important that there is a good state-business relations as well, and not too close, but at the same time a proactive engagement between the two parties, and that there's a base of trust, but also of helping each other as well. And finally, what we see in successful economic transformers economies is that there is also a lot of experimenting and learning, and this experimenting and learning is that acknowledges that you don't get it right in one go. You can't always say, well, this is the only path and this is the only path we can take. You need to learn and experiment and get feedback. And that is very important, to have these discussions in wider society around what is working, and do you need to think about course correction. Now, in this context, the current government has put in place a range of bills which can help with these issues, right? And of course, that's not to say that everything is well, and a lot of it needs to be implemented in the coming in the coming parliament, of course. But we have bills around fiscal policy, so the Public Finance Management Act. So it's really important to think about fiscal rules and about spending, for example. That needs to be embedded further. Secondly, there are issues around central bank independence. So very important that the next president will immediately sort of highlight this as a key feature, that the central bank remains independent and is able to make sure that it focuses on price stability, avoiding crisis and job creation. And then we need to see more. And I think that's where perhaps we should start in terms of the economic transformation bill. I mean, you can talk about the pros and cons of the bill itself, but you can't do away with the importance of economic transformation. And that needs attention. The economy isn't going to grow alone by fiscal policies, monetary policies that are horizontal across the economy. Whilst that is very important, it's necessary, and that's the first step. It's going to be investment climate plus, as it were. Make sure that you also are able to drive the economy forwards with pro-market economies, transformative economies, transformative policies that help to attract investment in the right economies, in the right sectors. It helps to export and promote export in those sectors that are more productive. It will able to foster innovation and technology development, skills development in the right sectors in order to drive your economy forward. And that's what we need to see from the next president is this. So one is a continuation of stabilization of the economy, but then a decisive next step towards a more transformative economy, because otherwise, after 3 years, as Bans is saying, Sri Lanka may face a very uphill struggle again, and that it might not be able to repay its debt. It may not be able to service its debt. It may not be able to reduce poverty that much. It really needs to be transformed economy. So the future is at a crossroads at the moment, I would say. And the future president really needs to take this next step towards a transformed economy. Let me stop there.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Before I move on to the next speaker, I'll just like to announce that the Q&A box is open for questions. So if anybody has a question, we encourage you to share your questions in our Q&A box, and you can start typing it in, and we'll try and address as many as we can at the end. So with that, now I'd like to move to our third speaker of the day, Professor Wickramasinghe. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. First of all, colleagues at NUS and at the ODI for inviting me to be part of this panel. So as was mentioned before, I'm a historian, I'm not an economist. So I'm going to talk about things that I'm familiar with. I worked also, between 1990 and 2009 in the history department of the University of Colombo, which is a large public university. And during this period, I was also very closely connected to the International Center for Ethnic Studies, which was then headed by late Dr. Neelan Tiruchelvam. So the comments I make are very much that of an observer, but also as an insider who's still concerned with and also involved in many ways in the life of the country. So I would like to start by stressing the importance and uniqueness of the present moment in Sri Lanka, which is seen as an unprecedented emergence of what I would call a politics of the people. And this phenomenon is, in my view, a lasting one and the outcome of long-term trends. So a number of social and political developments have crystallized in the present moment. And I would like to briefly say something about 3 processes that are very closely connected. So one is this gradual fall of what I would call the old order. The second is a change, is the essence of the political parties, where you see alliances rather than very sort of ideologically driven parties. And third is this emergence of a politics of the people that stems directly from the uprising or the Aragalaya. So first, the fall of the old order, and some of this is very, I mean, some of you who are Sri Lankanists or who are familiar with Sri Lanka would know all this, but I'm just going to reiterate for some who perhaps are not aware. So it all starts in 1931, actually, when the State Council is formed as a representative body. Sri Lanka was still under colonialism and under the Donamo Constitution, which was an experiment in self-government by the British. And it's quite an important moment because universal suffrage is then given for men and women. And Sri Lanka was the first country in Asia, actually, to obtain universal suffrage. So there's a long tradition of, politics and of political representation. But you also see at this moment the beginning of majoritarianism and a political system that is dominated by notables who systematically use, these patronage systems, clientelism, etc., to remain in power. And that's what's going to happen really for the next 90 years or so. In spite of constitutional changes, this class of notables are going to succeed in keeping power in their own hands. Now, today, this old order is facing its most dangerous moment, I would say. With the first time, you see the possibility of a handover to a leader who does not belong to this establishment. Now, a central feature of this old order is the domination of political families over a long period. And political dynasties are visible in Sri Lankan politics, not only at the national level, but also regional and local level. So I'm just going to say a few words on the three major families that have dominated the political establishment at the national level. But this same phenomenon is visible, at the regional and local level. So there's, of course, the family of D.S. Senanayake, who was the first Prime Minister of independent Sri Lanka. His son, Dudley Senanayake, his nephew, Sir John Kotalavala, also occupied the function of Prime Minister for the United National Party, as did extended family members such as J.R. Jayawardena, who was Prime Minister, then President from 77 to 89, Ranil Wickremesinghe, who was Prime Minister from 1993 to 1994, 2001 to 2004, 2015 to 2018, and who is now the President. The next is associated with the Sri Lanka Freedom Party. Its founder, S.W.R.T. Bandaranaike, his wife, Sirima Voratwatha Bandaranaike, their daughter, Chandrika Bandaranaike Kumaratunga, have all been Prime Minister or President of Sri Lanka during the last 4 decades. And the third family that has counted in the history of Sri Lanka is none other than the Rajapaksas. Its rise in the south, the Ruhuna, begins with Don David Rajapaksa, Mahinda's grandfather. Then Don David Rajapaksa is followed by Don Matthew D.M. Rajapaksas. And all these people, start their career in the State Council. So that's 1930s, so this is a long-term, establishment. But of course, D.A. Rajapaksa, who is Mahinda's father, remained at the margins of the Sri Lanka Freedom Party, which was then dominated by the Bandaranaikas. But the State Council, actually, it's important to think of it really as the foundation for these elites and their entourage to dominate the politics of the country. So today, the presidential contest seems to be between two outsiders, Sajith Premadasa, the son of late Ranasinghe Premadasa, who was president from 1989 to 1993, the only president who did not actually belong to this elite, and Anura Kumara Dissanayake, the leader of the NPP, who is also a non-establishment figure. So while one argument has been to place Sajith Premadasa within the establishment, I would rather see him as a kind of schizophrenic character who's torn between his own elite upbringing and his father's working class origins and pro-poor approaches. So in short, the old order that is based on the idea that elites and political families have an uncontested and legitimate role or burden to lead the people is no longer accepted. My second point, and I'll be shorter here, relates to the way all political parties have become alliances. So this time of single political parties, UNP, SLFP, Communist Party, LSSP, etc., contesting with very clear and diverging programs is over. So the old party system is being transformed into something much more fluid. And this is sometimes motivated by the pragmatic need to include and accommodate crossovers, which happens very often in Sri Lankan politics, by groups and individuals within the parliament. But there is also more to it. It reflects less rigidity in terms of ideological commitments. And if you take Anura Kumara Dissanayake, who is a longtime member of the opposition and the leader of the National People's Power, and he's the front runner. Now his NPP is actually a coalition of some 20 other political groups, although the JVP, the Janata Vimukti Peramana, is the driving force. And for this reason, because it's an alliance and because it's a coalition, the NPP's program is not Marxist in any sense, in spite of the state-run media likening its program to Chavez's Venezuela. In fact, it incorporates many policies that are commonplace in most European social democratic countries. You know, things like free education or free health. I mean, these are not sort of socialist ideas. These are very sort of accepted ideas in most social democracies. Perhaps not in the US and Britain, why the idea of a small state, you know, still prevails as a, you know, inheritance of Margaret Thatcher's era. So to read the attraction of the NPP as triggered by a radical agenda is, I think, a misunderstanding that people like Jayadeva Yuangoda and others have clearly underlined. You see a wide range of social constituencies, the urban and rural poor, working people, middle classes, professionals, students, women, and the youth. And they're all looking for something much more prosaic, encapsulated in the Sinhalese term, Venasak, change. What they want is change. You know, it's not some kind of sort of radical utopian dream. My third and final point is the emergence of the politics of the people. And here I draw a lot from my colleague, Professor Nirmal Devasiri's idea. Now he has identified this trend as a reactivation of the political domain of the people after the failure of class and nation. So there is this new form of active citizenship that has emerged, triggered by the understanding that Sri Lankan society and polity have been destroyed by decades of corrupt and inefficient governance, and by these 2 years of economic and social destruction, where the gap between the haves and have-nots has increased. So the Aragalaya was a reflection of this anger of the people and the growth of a politics of the people that overrode class and nation. And it symbolizes a rupture of the traditional elite masses consensus sustained through the electoral process for decades. But the goals of the Aragalaya for a systemic change were derailed with the installation of Mr. Wickramasinghe, who actually continued the status quo. So while he succeeded in improving economic indicators, it was not reflected in poverty levels. And the lack of action against the corruption of the Rajapaksa's regime and his cronies was also resented. And also the insensitivity and somewhat the arrogance to social suffering and inequalities that is displayed by the government. So Aragalaya demands for system change and inclusive and equitable reform programs. Fairness, integrity, and equity still resonate. So the contest, in my view, is now between Sajith Premadasa. I mean, although the polls, as Ganeshan mentioned, you know, cannot really be completely trusted, but it appears to be really a contest now between Sajith Premadasa's somewhat social democratic project and the NPP's pro-poor approach. So let the citizens decide. Thank you.
Thank you, Neera. Raja, can I invite you to share your comments?
Yeah, thanks, Iqbal. Thanks for inviting me for this important conversation. So I'm only speaking for myself. I'm not speaking for India or the Indian government. I mean, I'm not going to get dragged into the internal dynamics, but more broadly speak about geopolitics of Sri Lanka, India's stakes in it, and what has India learned from its recent experiences, and how that might shape its engagement with the outcomes in Sri Lanka. Firstly, I think that Sri Lanka is geopolitically important is not in doubt. That through the colonial era, I mean, I think you've seen the rise of the European capitalism, then followed by the colonial and imperial expansion. So much of the expansion of European capitalism and colonialism into Asia touched on Sri Lanka because of its location at the very center of the Indian Ocean. You could say the same thing today. It's also the center of the Indo-Pacific in a fundamental sense. That is, if you stretch it from South China Sea to the coast of Africa, east coast of Africa, Sri Lanka is there, right in the middle. Sri Lanka also sits on top of some of the most busiest sea lines of communication that go from both Africa and the Gulf to the economic locomotives of East Asia. So over the last 4 decades, as Asia become a great manufacturing and trading hub, the sea lines of communication have become even more important. And that in turn, I think, makes Sri Lanka's maritime location a very critical one. Now, I think when it's often said that, look, the politics of Sri Lanka is framed as it's between India and China. I mean, kind of, it's quite shocking. I mean, how much of the international coverage of the last 10 years, it's always China or India come into if not in the first paragraph or first sentence, not certainly in the first paragraph. But I think that is simplifying, I think, the question of Sri Lanka's geopolitics. It's not just China and India. In fact, today there are 2 rivalries playing out in the subcontinent. I think one is between India and China, surely, but there's also broader and bigger, probably more consequential US-China rivalry. So those of you, at least those in India, those who see what's happening in Pakistan, Bangladesh, across the board, you can see quite clearly a US that is increasingly present in South Asia in a manner that it was not. Because if you go back, its focus was largely on Afghanistan and Pakistan. Then in the post-91 era, in the last 10 years, a lot on India. But I think today, US is engaged quite substantively with the smaller countries of the region. And I think we're just probably we're at the beginning of a phase where the US will play a larger role. So there are both these rivalries will intersect. Beyond the US, I would say both the West as a whole, US and West, are still the main trading partners for Sri Lanka. For all the talk about China's economic rise, all the exports still, the GSP, much of the support, multilateral assistance, a lot of it, the West remains very, very important for all the nations of South Asia. I mean, India doesn't take that kind of an assistance, but for the rest of them, whether it's Pakistan, whether it is Bangladesh, whether it is Sri Lanka, US and Europe remain very, very important partners. I would also say Russia is also a critical player. Russia, if you see, is seizing wherever it can room to play. When we've seen that in Africa, we see that in Burma, we see that increasingly as a supplier of arms, as a opportunistic player in the region, you'll see that as well growing. So there are multiple actors in this region, and I think that's very, very important to remember. On geopolitics, I mean, if Sri Lanka was internally stable and had a predictable foreign policy, the geopolitics, we know how a Sri Lankan regime, whichever irrespective of its political color, would deal with the world. But unfortunately, I mean, Sri Lanka, like rest of South Asia, with the exception of India, has not had political stability. And if you see, India so Modi is in his 11th year, and before that we had Manmohan Singh for 10 years, and before that Mr. Vajpayee for 6 years. So there's been a relative political stability in India, which has not been the case in the other countries in South Asia. I mean, with Bangladesh, we had a prolonged rule, and I think that's been part of the problem of a single ruler staying for too long. But the fact is, there has been significant instability within these countries, and some of that gets translated into how they relate to the major powers. That is, unlike in most major countries, the domestic politics is not separate from great power relations, but I think the two intersect much more vividly in the smaller countries. And I think we've seen that in Maldives, we've seen that in Sri Lanka, we see that in Nepal, we're going to see it in Bangladesh probably in the days ahead. So I think the nature of Sri Lanka's geopolitics has varied with the nature of the regime internally, and that makes, in fact, the character of the regime that comes out of these elections of some importance for the other powers. That brings me to the second point. I mean, I would say for India, you can say it's the most interested party in the Sri Lankan elections, but it's also, I would say, it's recognized as today that it can't be an interventionist party. That while given India's own complicated history with Sri Lanka, or like with most of its neighbors, a long tradition of intervention, a long tradition of messing around with the domestic politics of other countries in the region, and also an intersection of the domestic politics of neighboring countries with India's domestic politics. That is, a Tamil question in Sri Lanka doesn't stay between Colombo and Jaffna. It draws in India, given the ethnic overlap. Similarly, across the board, the post-partition residues in Pakistan and Bangladesh continually connect India to the politics of the neighboring countries. And then in the smaller countries like Nepal, Bhutan, it's even to a higher degree. So therefore, India is in some ways enmeshed with the domestic politics, with the neighboring countries. So therefore, how it deals with it is an important question, and I'll come to that a little later. But for now, I think in the question of the way the domestic politics will play out in Sri Lanka, I think for India, it's the best option is to stay out. That having intervened in the past, that it makes sense for India to keep arm's length with the countries, with the domestic politics of the countries, because whether India, there is a natural temptation to blame India to what happens. That doesn't mean India is not intervening. I mean, the paranoid has enemies, but the fact is the intersection of the domestic politics of India and its neighbors creates conditions. So therefore, what I see today, that India is trying to engage with all the parties, including the JVP. We've seen the JVP delegations come to India, which has not been the case historically. So for India, I think it is trying to keep some distance so that it engages with all the political forces. Given India's the fact that many of the smaller countries today have a tendency to balance against India. It's not good or bad, but I think just as India practices non-alignment and strategic autonomy, all our neighbors also practice strategic autonomy. And given the weight and size of India, there is a natural tendency to seek autonomy from India, to escape India's overwhelming presence, and to reach out and connect to the other major powers as a way of balancing India. The question, I think, has been, what are the red lines? What are the ways in which this can be done? So whether it's a question of some Chinese ships calling in Sri Lankan ports, whether it is a question of a port contract to China, I think these issues have come into play in the last decade and more. So I think there is in all the countries of neighborhood, the question of how does India relate and deal with these issues has become an important one. That brings me to my third point, which is what we've seen is that I think India has burnt its hands repeatedly, and unlike insanity, you keep doing the same thing. I think there is some learning. I think in India's, how it ought to deal with our neighbors. One, I think, while the public discourse in India tends to be too self-referential, too narrowly focused, it's all about China, it's all about anti-India, pro-India. While that tendency is there in the public discourse, I would say the government has become a lot more sensitive, more realistic in its appreciation of what happens in the neighborhood. First, I think it does recognize there is domestic politics in our neighboring countries. It's not always about India. There are internal contestations for power. between communities, political parties, and that's par for the course. So India has to deal with it rather than seeing through the lens of very national security interests or seeing it in terms of rivalry with other powers. It has to let the politics play out. It cannot unilaterally determine those politics, and there's no question. And I think our past experience has shown that. So therefore, I think there is a recognition that playing with soft hands, let these processes play out, and deal with it. And I think we've seen in the Maldives case, at least, every change of regime has been accompanied by a major shift in the foreign policy of the government. But in the last 3 months, the last few months, certainly the Moise government, initial hostility to India, it's now coming back to engage India. I think Mr. Moise is going to come to India soon. He was there for Mr. Modi's swearing in, and he was sitting right next to Mr. Modi. So I think you see Delhi playing with soft hands, let things develop rather than getting into a panicky mode every time there is any kind of seemingly hostile situation in the neighborhood. The third aspect I would say to Indian policy is really to focus on building long-term integration, long-term connectivity, long-term economic interdependence, rather than focusing on is so-and-so pro-India or not. I think some of that we've seen play out in Bangladesh, but I think there is a recognition that, look, you can't tie yourself to one particular party, one particular formation. What kind of salvages India's position is really deeper interdependence, in which, irrespective of the nature of the government, there are stakes for whoever comes to power to deal with India on a reasonable basis. I wouldn't say this is a policy already fully implemented, but I think it's a policy that is being developed and work in progress. And we've seen some of that play out in Maldives, in Nepal, in spite of the fact that we've seen communist country, the governments talk about being more tilted towards China. Eventually, I think geography does assert itself. And I think for India, the challenge is to let geography do the work rather than a proclaimed hegemony or an assumption of automatic primacy in the region. That doesn't work, and hopefully that lesson has been learned. So I would say, specifically in the case of Sri Lanka, we've seen Delhi work closely with the recovery package for the last few years. So I think for India, then while it engages all the parties, I think today it's prepared to work with whoever comes to power on the basis of interests rather than a priori assumptions about where they belong or the demand that they should not have relations with other powers. I think all our neighbors are going to have relations with China and increasingly with the US. This again is a new factor that sometimes India has actually worked with the US in parts of the region. In Bangladesh, it seemed like it was not working. But over the longer term, I would say India is also learning to work with other powers so that it doesn't become a presumption of an exclusive sphere of influence. So I would say soft hand, let domestic politics play out, deal with whichever regime that comes to power, and learn to work with geography and promote interdependence. These, I think, are going to be elements of India's policy in dealing with Sri Lanka and political change in other countries in the neighborhood. I'll stop here.
Yeah. Thank you, Raja. Rajni, can I call on you now?
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Iqbal. And I thought it's very interesting to go last because I think it's a privilege to listen to the other panelists kind of express very interesting perspectives on the upcoming Sri Lankan elections. And so what I thought I would do in these 7 to 10 minutes is more or less give a political science perspective. I'm assuming that a lot of the people that are listening in are already familiar with the key candidates, and I know Professor Neera also went through several of them. So what I will do is very briefly discuss 5 observations that I think are quite pertinent and that hopefully would get the conversation also started afterwards. So the first observation that I would like to make is of party fragmentation. And again, this is something that Professor Neera, I think, just mentioned just now, that Sri Lanka's political party system has traditionally been a two-party one. And we have had some permutations of this since 1978, the rise of coalition governments, and then the transition of the 2 main parties, the UMP and the SLFP, to the SJB and the SLPP in the last election cycle. what's distinct about the current election cycle that we are facing is that this is the first time where even these two poles no longer exist. We have a three kind of horse race at the moment. And if you look at the various camps that are there, we can argue, I think, quite safely that the two pre-existing poles no longer exist. There's a lot of ideological eclecticism among these three groups. And this is important, I think, because with a lot of splintering of these parties, even as analysts, making observations or predictions is difficult. And at the same time, it means that for the voter, also making decisions is going to be not a very easy one. A second kind of key point that I wanted to raise under this observation of party fragmentation is to raise its importance when we look at the minority parties. So the fragmentation is happening not only among the three main political camps, but also within the minority parties. For example, if you look at some of the Muslim political parties and the Tamil political parties that are expressing support to the candidates, we notice an interesting observation, which is that at times the leadership of these parties express support to a particular candidate, but then we see another candidate trying to get support from the second tier and the third tier of these parties. So that's again a very interesting phenomenon. It's interesting also. So for example, if you look at the Northern Tamil parties, in this election, we are seeing many camps that are coming out. So we have one main one, for example, with ITEC, which indicates support for Sajith Premadasa. So I'm just trying to give an example here. The leader-elect, the popular leader, Sridharan, has remained largely silent on this issue. When we look at the other main Northern Tamil party, the All Ceylon Tamil Congress, it has advocated for a boycott of the elections. And then we have the idea of a Tamil common candidate, an idea that has been around, since the 1990s and such, but for the first time manifesting in this election. So this splintering, even within, say, this Northern Tamil vote, it occurs not within a vacuum. We need to understand the context in which splintering of the Northern Tamil vote is occurring. And among the key reasons for this, I would argue, is the absence of a polarizing candidate such as Mahinda Rajapaksa in the past. Two, the difficult endorsement of any of the present candidates. There's reasons for and against endorsing them. And importantly, I think it's important to ask, what does the splintering of positions mean for the influence of small parties, such as the minority parties, in an election like this? Typically, minority parties have exerted a significant amount of influence within our national elections. Will that continue? And also, importantly, with this splintering of the Northern Tamil political parties, what would the future of Northern Tamil politics look like in elections? Will there be a greater distancing? Will there be more polarizing happening within this camp? And what does that portend for the future of elections? The reason I keep flagging this is because I think a lot of the attention has been placed on the three main camps, the kind of playing field of the Southern Sinhalese-dominated candidates. And often we can miss the importance, I think, of the developments that are happening among the minority parties as well. So that was the first observation of party fragmentation. The second observation I wanted to make is this idea of an emerging liberal consensus and a move towards centrist politics within the main political camps in this upcoming Sri Lankan election. And what I mean by this emerging liberal consensus is that the three main camps are observed to adhere to certain stances on the economic and power sharing fronts. So, for example, if you look at the economic front, we can see that all three camps, even if for pragmatic reasons, if not ideologically, have acknowledged the framework within which national economic policy can be negotiated. So what I refer to here is not rejecting the IMF program, even if some of these other camps are making gestures to renegotiate and get a better deal. Of course, once we look beyond this economic kind of liberal consensus, we can see within the manifestos the various degrees to which these three groups consider the role of the market and the priority of the state. So there is the difference, but we have this consensus on the economic front. And one thing I think that's important to note here is that the president's economic discourse of stability can be safely said to have successfully dominated the campaign discourse, so as to make the two other opposition groups also having to respond along similar lines. This is a result of the economic crisis, of course, that economic issues get primacy during this time, but I also think it's it's a successful framing of the president's campaign as well. My second subpoint under this observation of liberal consensus in Sri Lanka's kind of campaign climate is that this move towards centrism is very likely, unsurprisingly, to pose significant problems when any of these, especially the opposition parties, come into power. We see the SJB being a rather catch-all party, and for the MPP, I think that this is going to be perhaps the biggest challenge of all, because we see that within a short span of time, the MPP, whose main party is the JVP, has increased or risen to power within a very short period of time. And it has had to cater to very different segments of the population that have different ideological leanings. And so in pragmatically making this move towards some degree of liberal consensus, even if it is along a spectrum, one would expect the challenges post-government to be quite difficult in accommodating these various contradictions, in addition to the numerous challenges that any government that comes into power during a time of economic crisis does. And just to give one example, it would be, I think there was a recent statement by the MPP leader, Andra Kumar Dissanayake, on statements to cancel Adani Group's wind power project in Sri Lanka due to sovereignty threats and lack of transparency. And I think that this is just one example indicative of the difficulty of addressing so many aspirations, especially while being a relatively newer player to this kind of prominence in national politics. The difficulty of managing the expectations, the high expectations of the voters, and trying to accommodate this rather new liberal position that is accommodating, while at the same time facing a strong pushback by the left or far left groups that are within or around it. So the second point was on the liberal consensus. My third point, which follows on the second point, third observation on the Sri Lankan presidential elections is what is the role of nationalism? When we talk about liberal consensus and we see the three main camps moving to some kind of similar positions on the economic issues, on the issues of power devolution, power sharing, the national question, we also see somewhat a coming together of these three camps, again, along a spectrum, with the president and the SJB, I think, making more stronger overtures towards the full implementation of the 13th Amendment, whereas the NPP has, at least in this instance, indicated that it's good to continue with the provincial council system. And so we have also observed all three campaigns trying to use some nationalist rhetoric, but and including avoiding clearly articulate positions with regard to the role of justice for war crimes during the civil war. But we have not seen these nationalist campaigns really taking off. And there can be several reasons for this. I mean, this is the first election after the Aragalaya, which had this unifying message of anti-establishment politics, which meant that the hegemonizing narratives that legitimized past governments, Sinhala Buddhist nationalism being among them, that has waned. So that could be one reason. And another interesting reason that I think Professor Nirmal Devasiri also raised recently is that even within the MPP, which I think is increasing prominence, and there is discourse of will it play a significant role in Sinhala Buddhist nationalism as it did in the late 1990s and early 2000s. But what we have observed in this election cycle is that the strong ideological proponents of Sinhala Buddhist nationalism have moved towards more peripheral parties, such as the Sarvajana Balaya. And so we are seeing a rather muted discourse on nationalism in this election cycle. The fourth observation out of 5, so just last 2 on the elections, is on political legitimacy, this issue of political legitimacy. One of the decreasing political legitimacy and the increasing disillusionment of citizens with political representatives for various reasons, such as corruption and such. This is not new to this election cycle. We saw similar themes before, including the 2015 election cycle, during the 2019 presidential elections, the promise of order and discipline, and this demand for an outsider to the political system. So this disillusionment has been there, but it's intensified post-Aragalaya. And so I think the question that we have is, as the relevance of political parties decline, as we see this fragmentation of political parties, and the political legitimacy of national political representatives being challenged post-Aragalaya are the sources of political legitimacy shifting. I think that's something to kind of observe in this election cycle. So, for example, we observe patronage politics and the role of it continuing to be important, but we are also seeing this trend in Sri Lanka where campaigns are trying to bolster their credibility through appendages. So by bringing in professionals, by bringing in academics, we saw this during the Gotabaya Rajapaksa administration, we see this through Vietmaga, and then we see this now through the MPP, through bringing in academics and such, diaspora. So it kind of raises this question, are political parties looking for alternative sources of credibility because some of the more traditional sources are being kind of debunked? And along with political legitimacy, I think I'd just fair to end this point saying that with some of the more establishment, the two establishment camps, which is the Vikramasinghe camp and the SJB camp, kind of having less political credibility on that ground, in the sense that they have been part of the system and with people demanding for a system change. The MPP has certainly a higher moral ground. But I think it's important to flag here is that with that comes a burden of having to cater to high expectations. And maybe going forward, it's important to think if the MPP fails to meet these expectations, what that does to the kind of paradigm of political legitimacy. The last point I wanted to raise is this issue of stability, instability. Are there the chances of increasing instability, especially post-election? I think there are certain signs that they are there. One of the causes of this, of course, is that this election could be one where the second count is activated, where no one candidate secures 50% of the vote. And in that interim period, until the second count comes out, there could be certain elements of instability, especially if the winner is wins by a small margin, if the winner is the second, is one who comes second, but who kind of surpasses the first in the second round. So there are these sources of instability. Then post-election, I think, is another significant source of that. We have seen different camps, especially the SJB, indicating, of course, that it would dissolve parliament if it comes into power. The NPP has, I think, been a bit more forthright in terms of it dissolving parliament and then kind of in the interim highlighting what it would do in the interim period. The NPP has indicated, I think, 3 possible scenarios, one in which the AKD becomes president and another person becomes MP. So AKD rules with 3 MPs. That's one scenario. The second scenario where it's a single president kind of ruling. And then the third scenario where there's a caretaker government. And I think this is quite interesting because in some of these scenarios, the issues of how much of stability can be maintained in such a kind of vulnerable moment, not just economically, but also democratically, because I think Sri Lanka is quite weak democratically post-Aragalaya. There's a lot of polarization, a lot of distrust. And so with this kind of final thought on questions of impending instability, regardless of the political camp, I think I would like to stop here, Iqbal.
Thank you, Rajni, and thank you to all the panelists. We've got the sort of I don't want to use the word broad sweep, but I mean what I mean to say is we have a multifaceted sort of approach to the elections and the implications of the results that might come out of the elections itself. We have a number of questions that have already come up on our question box, etc. But I'm going to synthesize 2 of the questions that I caught my eye immediately, and something that I had in mind as well with the discussion. So I'm going to rephrase 2 of the questions here, and I think these are primarily to Ganesh and Dirk, and they relate to the IMF loan bailout package. And I think there are 2 facets to the questions that have emerged and the question that I was going to pose as well. One is how much of space will any leader that comes up after these elections actually have, given the financial constraints Sri Lanka is confronted with, to actually renegotiate the package and to perhaps fulfill on some of the promises that they have pledged to. And related to this is, what would the implications of a potential renegotiation be for Sri Lanka?
if I may take that question, and it's a tricky question because on the campaign trail, certainly the SJB and the NPP have said that they will renegotiate. And I think I read somewhere that an IMF team may come 2 weeks afterwards to have a chat. This, in my view, is a very risky venture for a country like Sri Lanka that in 2028 is going to have to repay its capital and interest. And that's a very tall order. The issue is in the current program that what they call the key structural benchmarks are fixed. So things like there's a requirement of primary surplus of 2.3% of GDP. The Central Bank Act, giving the central bank enormous independence to control inflation, is another parameter. And the debt sustainability analysis on which the entire program is based. These are fundamental, and some want to do this. Now, if you want to try to renegotiate these things, it will involve potentially a disaster story for Sri Lanka. The prolonged negotiations and interruption of the program, can lead to interruption of all development financing for Sri Lanka. And if we don't have an IMF program, like in 2021, 2022, nobody will provide Sri Lanka with any external financing. And I just want to underline as part of that conversation, Sri Lanka only has about 2 to 3 months of import cover in our reserves for essential imports of food, fuel, and medicine, which is really not much headroom. And so leaving the program means a lot of hardship for the people. So the more optimal approach is to try to implement this program till 2028, reallocate fiscal spending. So one of the things we did in the book of essays was to work out what we call fiscal multipliers. There's a lot of waste in government spending. We need to reallocate that towards more productive sectors, and that can have a huge impact on growth and also tax revenue, and to really target the welfare to the poor. So talking is fine, but I think they will find that the IMF is a bank and wants to be repaid, and trying to renegotiate and change that is just going to be very difficult. That's my candid take, Iqbal.
Thank you. Yes, please, Dirk.
Yeah, sure. I think Ganesh laid out the challenges there. And it's a really interesting question. So for us sort of economists, because of course the politics and the economics is interlinked here, as it always is. And there are a range of areas that have come up in the seminar today about where the politics and the economics intermingle. On this particular issue about IMF, I think there's also a chapter in the book that we've edited by my colleague Phyllis Papadavid, who looks at the Greek experience, and that's also a well-known experience around the challenges that emerged and the bailouts that were needed, like 3 bailout packages. And the problem there was that the IMF program also became a political tool, and it very much involved the politics. And what it did was it just led to a huge delay in the restructuring that was needed anyway. And it basically led to more suffering, more poverty, lesser employment than was intended. And so there is a very big danger, I would say, of renegotiate, basically politically stable, want to renegotiate and make this a political tool, because if you delay things, you suffer even more. And you're not going to have suffer for 2 or 3 years, but for 10 years, for a decade. And it's a lost decade. And it's only now that Greece is a major performer in the European context. Of course, Sri Lanka is not the same as Greece, but there are those issues. So I would say it's really important to really think twice about what exactly do you mean by renegotiating. And actually, the issues aren't solved by an IMF program. The underlying issues about economics are solved by the government itself. What the government is doing, basically, in this context. And IMF only allows you to be able to some headspace to think about it. But if you don't use that space, you also have a problem. And as I was saying, basically, my intervention earlier is you need to transform your economy. You need to think about structural policies that help you get out of the crisis. The IMF helps you with that. If you think somehow the IMF is not a problem and renegotiate help, that I think is not necessarily the right focus. That said, I mean, I wouldn't say that the IMF sustainability analysis are always perfect. And in fact, we have, I mean, not in the case, this particular case now in Sri Lanka, but just a couple of weeks ago, another colleague of mine, Sherin Vaga, did a paper around the challenges of forecast included in DSA analyses that sometimes are maybe too optimistic, which means that there's too much emphasis on fiscal consolidation, too little on the importance of debt restructuring. But that's maybe a more general point about other analyses. I would now say that it's really important to be thinking about what policies help you to transform your economy, and in that context, the IMF program can help you. And if that means like some tweaking or some discussions, then I'm sure that may help. The other two issues, perhaps, I would just want to come back to, I think, on the link between politics and economics, because I think we heard from the professor from the University of Leiden, Nina Victor saying that was really interesting. It's also how ingrained sort of the families are in political development. But there is some scope for changes, right? That's some emergence, that something or something was emerging, some more consensus, some more pragmatism rather than clientelism. I think that's also what we see in other countries, is basically that sometimes that happens, and at the same time, the economic transformation can also happen. So you can become more open, so that you don't are a productive economy, subsidies for the few, but that you can become more open, and it's a more transparent economy where you facilitate the market in a more transparent way, not only to particular the few. And the other point about geopolitics, I think, is also really important, where politics and economics relates very well to in the case of Sri Lanka. Professor Rai Mohan, I think, was talking. I think there, what is also important is how the economic analysis can inform geopolitics as well. I would have thought that, for example, engaging more with India is really important. I think the modeling in the book by my colleagues Max, Johannes, and others also, and Ganesh, suggest also that having a deep free trade agreement with India, so deeper than is currently the case, will help you economically. So there's economic benefits from it, which will help you to address some issues. So I think it's also important in this geopolitical situation to be thinking about where's the economics, and that some free trade agreements with some countries really make sense, and it's important to continue that and that progress. Let me stop there. I find it really interesting, these discussions around interlinkages between politics and economics.
Thank you. Raja, I know you will have to leave quite shortly after this. So maybe since your name was actually mentioned as well, I'll just throw one of the questions that I anticipate coming up as well, is that is it time, perhaps drawing from your discussion earlier, is it time to perhaps reframe from geopolitics to geoeconomics, the relations between India and Sri Lanka?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you absolutely. I mean, and also with the professor who spoke earlier. Look, I think the problem with India and neighbors has been the economic projects have been politicized. I mean, that doing anything with India, irrespective of the benefits it brings to the neighboring country, is seen as a problem. So therefore, irrespective of the terms that China offers, and many times you think a China project, because I think it is driven by, you can say, fear of China, the need to balance India, sorry, fear of India, the need to balance India. That I can understand those imperatives, but I think often the distortion of economic policies because of the fear of Indian dominance, I think, has complicated matters. I mean, I think as we saw in the Sri Lankan case, where the Indian assistance was fairly good. So there is talk about a free trade agreement between, renewing the comprehensive economic agreement with Sri Lanka, but I'm not sure. I mean, maybe Ganesh can talk about it. There was a lot of hesitation. There is a question of, how will it affect Sri Lanka? And I think trade agreements have always have politics. But I think given the larger, considerations, if you have a large market next door, which is $4 trillion, how do you exploit it? Must be part of the strategy for whoever sits in power in Colombo. So I think there, I would say, I mean, forget India first or, India out, whichever way you want to choose. What is the best? So if you argue it on first principles of economics, rather than saying, look, India is a problem, therefore we go to the Chinese, or the other way around, or India claiming because it is India, it needs the first cut at a project. This way, I think we need more pragmatic engagement on economic projects, depoliticization. Easier said than done, given the history of, we stepped on each other's, in India stepped on neighbors' toes quite a bit. So I think that's a reality. But I think India is learning to say, look, let's depoliticize economic projects. And I think something that will continue. I think things have changed in the last decade, certainly between India and Nepal today. There's more power flowing between Nepal to India, India to Nepal. There is more oil and hydrocarbons flowing from India to Nepal. There was an attempt, I don't know, it'll survive the change in Bangladesh, intergrid connectivity between India, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Bhutan. So I think there have been progress in some parts of South Asia, and I think there's been a similar discussion with President Wickremesinghe in the last few months. So if some of that can take off, irrespective, without a reference to politics, that itself, I think, will produce good conditions under which economic stabilization can take place within the neighborhood. But then the volatility of politics is always a problem. But I would just ask, I mean, when the mass politics takes place with high ideals, the reality of more mundane considerations always seem to trump the high ideals at which larger politics plays out. So I hope actually that the high ideals that have inspired Sri Lankan politics over the last few years, some of them will translate into in internal consensus, and at the same time a kind of pragmatism that looks beyond the previous traditions that existed. So I think one must be hopeful for the subcontinent. Things have changed. Change is going to be inevitable, but even if one or two countries can set the example of a different direction, that'll be great.
Thanks, Raja. We have a number of questions on domestic politics as well, which I will point towards Neera and Rajni to take, and I'll let you all decide who wants to go first on those. One question which I'm rephrasing and I'm trying to merge some of the questions together, and I hope I do justice to them. One of the questions is about the potential structural change that these elections could actually bring. And Neera, you hinted at this in your discussion as well. So the question goes that out of the three main contestants, Ranil, Sajid, and Anura is posing a big challenge to the two candidates. How do you perceive the future policy challenges if Anura wins or stands second in these elections? I suspect the question is about whether we are sensing some sort of a structural shift in the political arena and discourse itself. Neera, would you like to start that? I'm sorry, you need to unmute.
Yes, so I think, as was mentioned in a number of the other interventions, there is the program that people put forward when they are contesting an election, and then there is the reality when you are in government. And I think any government that will take over after this one, whether it's Anura Kumara Dissanayake or Sajid Premadasa or any other, will have to live up to the claims and the promises that they made during the campaign. I couldn't read in detail the 250 odd pages of the NPP manifesto, which was in Sinhala also. But from what I understand, this manifesto and this program is for them sort of a social contract, and that they plan to implement gradually the different aspects of this program. Now, I think it will depend a lot the goodwill of the existing structures, in place. And there can be, of course, a lot of obstruction to some of the measures that they plan, because some of them are obviously going to affect, a number of social groups and people in high places. So I think, however, that some of the measures are wished, and there will be a consensus, for example, for transparency of government financial operations. There'll be also more transparency on procurement contracts. I mean, these kinds of measures, everybody should agree to these, and also more accountability, more monitoring. Civil society wants also to be informed, about what's happening. Be able to track public funds. I mean, one of the main complaints of the people is that they are being taxed, but they don't trust where their money is going, because of the embezzlement and the type of corruption that has prevailed in the decades before, and also the lack of the fact that the people who were involved in these types of embezzlement are still walking around freely, so I think the NPP will definitely have to act on corruption if it wants to remain and keep this kind of image of clean government that it claims to uphold. So that is something that is going to affect a lot of quarters, and that's why there is fear and anxiety among people that there might be some, like a public prosecutor's office put in place, and that people are going to be taken to task. So I think a large part of their program will be implemented, and I hope that if they come into power, that there isn't going to be systematically obstruction on the part of the different institutions at play.
We have about 7 minutes, and I have a few questions, so I'm going to request answers to be brief so I can get through all of them. But Rajni, if I could throw a follow-up question to you on that. There's a question about the NPP and whether it will be able to accommodate the quote-unquote liberal consensus in its future politics.
Yeah, I think I kind of agree with some of the other speakers in that the NPP's kind of current purity politics, kind of this unwillingness to kind of partner with other establishment parties. I think that this sometimes gives rise to this perception that that the NPP is something quite unprecedented. But I mean, I do agree with the fact that past governments, from Chandrika Bandaranaike government to the Mahinda Rajapaksa government to even the Yapalana government, it had a meeting together of these more conservative, both identity-wise, but also in terms of economics. All of these governments had this challenge of reconciling this more liberal economic as well as identity politics-wise, and then the more left-leaning state interventionist idea. So I don't think that the MPP's challenge is very new in terms of that. So I think I'll leave it at that.
Okay. And I want to switch tracks back to the economic question again. There is a question about the future prospects of potential of diversifying the economy. The question goes, recently there have been several reports of an impending global recession in 2025. How will such global headwinds impact Sri Lanka's current economic recovery and recommended reforms to transform the economy to a more export-oriented, market-friendly economy?
So briefly, to answer that question, I mean, we are a small open economy and we get hit by external shocks. Now, a lot of that depends on where the shock originates and how it transmits to a country like Sri Lanka. So, for instance, the most recent shock is the Red Sea shock, which there is a consensus that it has not affected Sri Lanka so badly yet. But if we have a big Israel-Iran conflict with Hezbollah and so on, and that's upscaled a lot, the shock could come in through rising petroleum prices, through the exports that we send to the Middle East, through indeed our migrant labor that comes and so on. So a lot of it depends on the channels, Professor, to be honest with you. But certainly as an export-oriented small economy, if there is a global downturn in the next year, that will be difficult on Sri Lanka and will hurt its ambition to be an export tourism-oriented economy. I mean, that's for sure. So we talked a lot about instability on the economic front with this discussion with the IMF and the challenges that may bring. We talked about domestic politics and the struggle between statism and the liberal order. Now we have a third element, this external economy globally, which could also impinge upon us. So I think really what it all means then is we really have to have a very pragmatic program, both on the economy as well as a political agenda, and also try to build relations with our neighbors and others if we want to move forward after January 2025. Thank you.
Doug, would you like to add something?
Yeah, sure. And also linked to the other question in the chat on lack of hope and outward migration. I think in a sense, if Sri Lanka find it difficult to attract investment in its economy, and there's outward migration of people and skills, you've got a big problem, right? So what you need is to change the narrative and make sure that you have both attract inward capital and keep the skills. It's what we call capital skill complementarity, and they go together, right? And it is possible. So my first project at ODI, it was 24 years ago, I looked at FDI policies in Ireland and Singapore, so Republic of Ireland and Singapore, and both countries had a challenge. So they had a problem with the domestic sector, and or were cut off from the hinterland, so Singapore and Malaysia, and then Ireland as well. And what they did was basically thinking about a strategy to attract foreign investment, and they really needed to rely on foreign investment to develop their economy. And at the same time, they had schemes in place to attract skills and to keep skills and to retain skills. And so in the case of Ireland, they actively said, well, US companies, please come to our country. And they're also ringing up the Irish diaspora abroad to say, if this capital is coming to the country, i.e. the new factories and so on, are you willing to come back? And they were able to solve this coordination failure. And this was like a new strategy of hope. And I would say that that's the answer also to some of the question in the chat, is to sort of say, well, have a new path of a transformative economy. You target in a market-friendly way, and in a transparent way, new industries or high productive industries, and at the same time offer opportunities for the skills to stay. That is more promising avenue, and it will lead to a sort of a positive synergy. And I think that's the sort of situation we need to see. And it's not that countries haven't done it. It is possible. So I hope that the political system can change or can evolve in such a way that it allows those type of policies that, say, Ireland, Singapore has put in place in the past, which are able to proactively target industries in a market-friendly way and keep the skills and offer new hope and productivity change, and therefore sustained job creation, poverty reduction as well. So I feel there is hope.
That was a very optimistic answer to a question that could potentially be a bit gloomy. And it is on that optimistic note, it is the best point to end the discussion of today. So we've come up to the end of our time today. I know there are some questions we didn't get to address, but this is a work in progress. So we'll have more events, and we look forward to more collaborations with ODI as well. But thank you all for joining us today. It's been a fascinating discussion. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure our viewers have also enjoyed the discussion. So thank you all again, and we look forward to meeting again after the elections.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Have a good day.